Innovating Education Learning World in association with WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.
At various times throughout history, entire populations have been denied their identity. Today, efforts are being made to preserve traditional culture and language. Our first story takes us to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, part of France. There, the government has recently incorporated the history of the ancestors in its curriculums. Let's find out more in this report.
This is the largest school in Guadeloupe, and this mural commemorates 150 years since the abolition of slavery in 1848. Since 2000, the subject has been taught in schools here.
The Minister of Education has adapted the school curriculum in this region. So here we teach some things that aren't necessarily taught all over France. The history of slavery and the slave trade, for example, are taught as well as other subjects. So we're allowed to go further into it. And we have an extra hour a week to teach these subjects.
This crèche is named after a slave who was killed for resisting captivity. From the age of 6 years old, children in Guadeloupe study their history. People here think school is the best place for this process of collective memory and reconciliation.
During slavery, the masters let the slaves rest in the evening and they danced and they played drums.
In the past, Creole was looked down on as a language because it was mainly spoken by the descendants of slaves. Creole speakers were often excluded from economic and social opportunities, reinforcing low self-esteem amongst Creole-speaking children. Slaves weren't allowed to cut wood, so they used old barrels to make instruments, like this drum, which is called a car.
We live within the French system, so it's right that we should learn how this system functions for when we grow up. But I think it's also important to learn about our traditions in Guadeloupe.
From the guoca's African rhythms to young Mexicans improvising on stage in an ancient language. For these students, campesino theater is about more than preserving a traditional culture. It's also a way of reviving and teaching one of Mexico's indigenous languages. Here's our report.
Here in central Mexico, many people speak variations of the old traditional pre-Columbian Zapotec language. Theatre is used to keep traditions alive in the face of encroaching westernization.
We chose theatre as a way of educating people, strengthening the language and the cultural identity of the indigenous people.
Teatro Campesino is specific to this region. The locals are the actors. There's no script, just a canvas. The language is Zapotec and the themes are indigenous community life, the generation gap, ancient myths and traditions.
We have this tendency to think that Zapotec isn't a proper language and that foreign idioms and Spanish are more valuable.
The government has no interest in you sowing your own seeds and feeding yourself. They want to supply everything. Supposedly, they want to help you. In the past, men were seen as better than women. Women had to stay at home and cook.
Girls take part in the performances and speak their minds.
Mi preocupación siempre ha sido la armonía, el respeto y el entendimiento comunitario. Por ello,
y para que ustedes se vayan olvidando eso de que Dios Quetzalcóatl, que Dios del cielo, que Dios de la lluvia, eso ya no sirve, señores.
For more than a decade, Australians have held a national Sorry Day to express their regret over historical mistreatment of Aboriginal people. Nowadays, they are taking further steps to preserve their own culture. One man has campaigned hard to promote the teaching of Aboriginal values and traditions in schools. Here's his portrait.
I think that Aboriginal education has given me my start in life. And without that start, I wouldn't be here. Without that start, I wouldn't be advocating for Aboriginal education and the education of all children. Black and white together, all of us together. A schooling that reinforces Aboriginal interests, values and visions is what I'm passionate about. I grew up on an all-Aboriginal community 2 hours from the main area of Adelaide. My education, I was always surrounded by schools. My mother was the first female Aboriginal principal in Australia. She founded the first urban Aboriginal school in Australia, the Gowna Plains School.
We live in a dominant society, so we have to educate our kids to be proud of themselves, but to be able to work in a society that they're going to have to do in the future. But to make two-way education really important.
Because that is important, isn't it? English is really important, and literacy, but also our culture and identity needs to be
very strong.
Important.
Yes.
There have been some really terrific successes. We saw the Gowna Plains School, where language and culture is fixed into the curriculums, into the school canteen, into the corridors, onto the carpets, onto the wall. And I think one of the key successful ingredients to an Aboriginal education is a school that reinforces the identities and cultures inside the school and does never ask the children to leave their languages and identities at the school gate. Identity is in our flag that's flown out the front. We also need teachers, trained Indigenous and non-Indigenous teachers, to know all of the art and science about teaching Aboriginal children and Aboriginal education. And that's what I've been on about in the new national curriculum for Australia. Schools are the place where we learn to share. I think it also will allow Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Australia to come together, to share their histories, to share their languages, their cultures. After all, Aboriginal languages are Australian languages, are Australian cultures, and Australia really deserves to have these languages live on.
That's it for now from the Learning World team. Keep watching, we will be back next week.
Learning World in association with WISE, an initiative of Qatar Foundation.